Check, check. Folks, just wanted to say we're waiting on a couple speakers and we'll start in about 10 minutes. So continue to enjoy yourselves. Talk to you more soon. Thanks.
I'm Omar. No,
Omar,
I look
I'm
like
sorry.
Andy though. Yeah.
A little bit.
You know,
It's
big
a
bald
haircut.
Arab. Yeah, I just.
It's a haircut.
Yeah.
So Ralph Nader's newspaper.
Yes.
I find it. Have you ever seen it?
Yeah. I have. So I work at. I should not say that since we're live streaming. I want to leave that separate from my work here. But yeah, I work at one of the organizations that Ralph founded. So we get these every now and then.
Oh, I bet you do.
Yeah.
He excerpted the first part of an essay I wrote on page 18. To get a chance.
Oh, very cool. Yeah, we'll check it out.
So on page 18, you put a first part of an essay that I wrote, and you can see the whole thing in LA Progressive. If you haven't seen the newspaper,
I don't want to take it up here, but I'll get one from
Yeah. Terrific. But no, like it's always extremely valuable, the stuff that's in there. So, yeah,
It's an
really appreciate it.
artifact.
Yeah. Yeah. We'll talk a lot more.
Oh, do you know more?
Yeah, I mean, in general, yeah, I'll tell you something.
When I'm at an event and standing next to you, and a man is approaching and saying, "Are you Omar?" I'm like, just getting ready.
So I have yet to have a physically threatening altercation. There was one TV show where a guy was extremely rude to me. He was basically practically wanting to get in a fight. It was awkward. Otherwise, thankfully, it has not crossed that line.
People know that you're an MMA
It's possible.
champion.
I brought a bottle with me.
Hello, hello. We are going to get started. Thank you all so much for coming out. Good evening. My name is Kari Peterson-Smith. I'm the Michael Ratner Middle East Fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies. And IPS organized this event tonight that we're so grateful to see you at. There's a lot going on in the world and in this country right now. And so we don't take it for granted that you've come here to be together and to discuss really important things in a conversation framed by really incredible thinkers and activists. Like I said, my name is Kari. I'm at the Institute for Policy Studies. And what's unfortunate, of course, is the occasion that has brought us here tonight. It's horrendous that Benjamin Netanyahu, who has had a years-long career of all kinds of violence against Palestinians and others, and is currently presiding over genocidal violence in Gaza. That man and his actions have earned him protest all around the world, including in the communities and on the campuses of this country. But it has, he's being honored, actually, tomorrow with the opportunity to speak to a joint session of Congress. That is a rare honor given to, actually for anybody, but particularly for foreign heads of state. And when Netanyahu takes the stage tomorrow, it will be his fourth time receiving that honor, more than any foreign head of state in US history. This is, of course, a time of crisis, a time of real instability in the US. I don't have to name the reasons, you all know. But the fact that Netanyahu is speaking at Congress tomorrow reminds us of what has yet to change. And in particular, I think about the commitment on the part of the federal government of this country in the investment in normalizing and really supporting this kind of violence that Israel carries out and that Netanyahu in particular has presided over for so long. Netanyahu, because of his actions and the way he goes about them, is a very controversial figure, and it's quite shocking how uncontroversial he is in the US Congress, at least not controversial enough to not invite him to give a joint session, to address a joint session of Congress. It really says something that there is more disagreement in the state of Israel that Netanyahu presides over about him giving this speech than there is in the US Congress. That is something that we need to change drastically. The other thing, of course, that has not changed is what is happening, what Israeli forces are doing in Gaza. There is a certain perspective in this country, particularly in Washington, in the halls of power, that what's happening in Gaza is this unfortunate thing, and it's kind of in an ongoing way unfortunate, and that it has to stop at some point. The reality is, not only has it been absolutely horrendous well before October, but certainly since, but that it actually gets worse and worse each day. And folks may know that yesterday there was yet another massacre in Khan Yunis with dozens of people killed, hundreds wounded. That has not changed. And while we are rightly focused on Gaza in particular tonight, it must be said that Israeli violence and the violence that Netanyahu is presiding over extends well beyond. Not only is the level of intensification of colonial violence escalating all across Palestine, but across the region. In the past 10 days, Israel has bombed 4 countries: Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, and now Yemen. So, we are here tonight to have the conversation that should be happening much more in this country, and certainly that should be happening much more in this city. And we are very lucky to have this amazing panel of folks to start us off. I will begin with a bit of a regret that Iran Efrati from Jewish Voice for Peace was unable to make it tonight, and he sends his regards. But the panel that we have is really an embarrassment of riches in terms of people who have such insight on this moment in which Netanyahu is giving this speech, which is what we're here to talk about. So I'll introduce them first, and then I'll let them speak. Omar Badar is a Palestinian-American political analyst based here in Washington, D.C., specializing in U.S. policy toward Palestine and Israel. His media appearances include CNN, MSNBC, Democracy Now!, BBC, and Al Jazeera, among other platforms. Zaina Shrari Hutchinson, on my right, is the Director of Development and Expansion at the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee, ADC, and a Palestinian-American rights activist and community organizer. And my colleague Phyllis Bennis from IPS, the Director of the New Internationalism Program at IPS and International Advisor to Jewish Voice for Peace. So we will hear from our incredible panel, and then we will open it up for a conversation. Thanks again, and thank you so much to Busboys and Poets every day, and especially for hosting us tonight. Omar?
Thank you so much. I'll call you Khoury. I'm one of your few Arab friends who have Arabized your name. Not entirely against his will, he's embraced it.
I have a lot of Arab friends.
Fair enough.
And
They all Arabize his name. Yeah, I wish we were here under better circumstances, again, just because I have so much love for the people on stage, for the incredible work you do, Zaina. And Phyllis, I remember from my undergrad college activism days, is when I was always reading the stuff that you were writing and incredibly impressed by it. And as part of sort of what I wanted to do more of is do effective communication on this issue so people understand it, because there's such a misunderstanding of it that is deeply frustrating in this country. And in the case of Khoury, we met actually during the first Israeli onslaught against Gaza in 2008, 2009, since the siege began. And that attack seemed unprecedented at the time. It seemed like it would be difficult to top. The fact that 1,400 Palestinians had been killed, more than 300 children, it seemed like such a horrific moment that required us to activate. And it only seems trivial compared to the genocidal violence that we are witnessing today. And that's a really, really depressing reality. And what's even more infuriating about it is the fact that you don't get anywhere near an accurate picture of what is actually happening in Palestine and in Gaza in particular, watching American media coverage of it. If you turn on Fox News, you get Israel is the good guys, Palestinians are the bad guys, and the more Palestinians are killed, the better, yay. That's effectively the narrative. You turn on so-called liberal media outlets, corporate media that's supposed to represent the so-called mainstream liberal establishment in this country, you get a slightly different picture. You get Israel, the protagonist good guys, Hamas, the antagonist bad guys, and the Palestinians who are suffering in the middle. There is some coverage of their suffering, but it's all an unfortunate outcome, and it's primarily Hamas's fault, and Israel's still the good guys. That's the narrative that you get on the other end of that spectrum. And nowhere is the reality allowed to actually penetrate as part of that narrative, and that reality is that the Israeli government is a malevolent, racist apartheid regime that is deliberately waging a war against the civilian population of Gaza. That is the reality that is actually unfolding. You see it in the genocidal statements of Israeli leaders. You see it when Netanyahu refers to the Palestinians as the Amalek who must be destroyed, a reference to biblical passages that talk about the killing of an entire people and specifying their children and their infants. You hear it when Netanyahu says that we have to thin down the population down to a minimum in Gaza. That is effectively the policy that we're witnessing. You hear it when the Israeli defense minister talks about treating Palestinians in Gaza like human animals and cutting off all food and water and electricity from people living in Gaza. And you see it in the consequences of those policies directly, of every single major human rights organization in the world documenting the fact that Israel is engaged in indiscriminate bombing in Gaza. The fact that people are being deliberately starved to death. The fact that at least dozens, if not hundreds of children have been starved to death. That you have a minimum of 40,000 people who have been killed in Gaza. And that estimate does not include the thousands of people who are missing under the rubble, who can in fact be assumed dead at this point. And if you consider what a report that came out in The Lancet somewhat recently, suggesting that if the war were to stop today, that when you consider the fact that what we have is almost certainly an undercount, and you add to it all the secondary deaths that are not the direct result of direct fire in this genocidal campaign, but from lack of access to clean water and lack of access to medical facilities and health support, that death toll, if the genocide were to stop today, is conservatively 186,000 people. That is the scale of the violence that we are currently witnessing. You see it in the videos of Israeli soldiers screaming genocidal slogans while opening fire indiscriminately at Palestinian civilian population centers in Gaza. You see it in the testimony of doctors, one of whom was just interviewed on CBS News and had written in Politico about the fact that they have repeatedly seen young Palestinian children being the targets of Israeli sniper fire, multiple bullets to the head and chest. There is a systematic targeting of children unfolding in Gaza, and you would not know that if you were to watch American corporate media about it. And elsewhere, separate from Gaza, in the West Bank, another occupied territory under international law that the ICJ just said is illegally occupied by Israel. The occupation is transparently illegal. Where Hamas does not rule the Gaza Strip, does not rule the West Bank, rather. And yet, Israeli settler violence and the Israeli military have killed hundreds of Palestinians in the past few months there. And once again, you can see the footage documented of children playing in the streets, being shot by the Israeli military. when they have clearly posed absolutely no threat to anyone and could not possibly have been mistaken for a threat in that context. And a systematic effort to colonize the West Bank through the building of more and more illegal settlements, systematically driving Palestinians off their land, systematically taking away their water and their ability to live a dignified life. That is a project that is unfolding day in and day out and is the reality that exists for literally decades now. And I don't want to get into the details of history of sort of what happened in 1948 exactly, and 67 and 56 and what else. Suffice it to say that if you just really zoom out and think about what the fundamental problem is here, the problem simply is that there is a population ruling the land between the river and the sea that insists on making sure that Palestinians do not have rights and live endlessly under brutal oppression where they can be murdered at will, thrown out of their homes at will. And if they don't like it, they can leave. And if they ever fight back, then Israel unleashes far greater violence, just massacres at unprecedented scale. That is the dynamic. And that is a dynamic that is set up to breed conflict because it has to. No justice, no peace is not just a slogan that you shout at a protest. It is a descriptive reality about human nature, that in any situation in which there is brutal injustice that is being suffered, that is a recipe for conflict where there can't be peace, and that is why we are in the situation that we're in today. You look at it historically, when you think of the land of Palestine historically, there were Canaanites and Jews and Romans and Babylonians and Crusaders and Persians and Ottomans. The list of civilizations that have existed on that land is endless. And we're supposed to operate differently in modern times under international law and respect for human rights. We tell ourselves that the world is different now. And yet the idea that we're contending with is that one ethno-religious group from the entire history of that land not only gets to return, which is of course fine, anybody should be able to live, frankly from my perspective, there should not be borders at all, everybody should live whatever they want to. If people want to go back and reconnect with their ethno-religious roots, that's just fine. But the idea that one ethno-religious group from the history of that land from thousands of years ago gets to not only return to it, but to own it and treat anybody else who's indigenous to that land like garbage and ensure that they don't have rights under a system of permanent apartheid and a slow-motion ethnic cleansing, that is a grotesque idea. And the United States has not only put up with it, but has actively supported it. And Palestinians have tried every avenue possible to achieve freedom that was available. The US urged them to negotiate. They negotiated. Turns out the negotiations are a complete farce. I mean, the Palestinians bent over backwards to, frankly, accept a two-state solution that is unfair to Palestinians. It restricts them to only 22% of their historic homeland. They were willing to make that compromise, and yet Israel was so drunk with power that they insisted on colonizing all of the occupied territories, did not give an inch, did not cede an inch, wanted to have Palestinians under complete and total control, that there was never an offer of viable Palestinian statehood on the table. They tried to go to the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court. They've engaged in boycotts that Israel describes effectively as economic terrorism. If you dare to try to stand up with your pocketbook to say you don't want to support a foreign country's war crimes, which, by the way, illegal Israeli settlements in the West Bank are war crimes. If you don't want to support those with your pocketbook, you can essentially risk being punished by American states that are passing laws suggesting that you can't have a job with the state, you can't work at certain schools or hospitals if you boycott Israel or Israeli settlements. At a time when in this country we celebrate boycotts as a part of American culture. It's part of the founding of this country, the boycott of British tea. It is part of the civil rights movement in this country, the Montgomery bus boycott. You can boycott American businesses, and you have American politicians calling for the boycotting of American states over LGBTQ rights and other things. That's fine, but boycotting a foreign country's war crimes is not okay. It's just completely and totally absurd. And we saw the culmination of all of this Palestinian effort to look for a peaceful way out of this in the March for Return in 2018, where Palestinians living in Gaza for literally decades at this point No airport, not allowed to have an airport. No seaport, no access to the outside world, can't travel in and out. The economy is in ruins because Israel controls what goes in and out of Gaza and refuses to allow the economy in Gaza to function. No trade with the outside world. No medical equipment for people in Gaza that enables them to deal with cancer cases. You have to beg for permission from Israel to get a permit to leave Gaza so you can seek health treatment elsewhere. And those are rarely granted in very exceptional cases that they're actually given. Palestinians were reduced to nothing in Gaza, and the natural human instinct to want your children to do better than you did was impossible in Gaza. And the last resort was a civil society protest marching to the border, to effectively the barrier separating Israel from Gaza, demanding an end to the siege. Unarmed people walking and marching to that fence area, and Israeli snipers, according to every human rights report that you can find, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, the UN, opening fire into a crowd of civilians, deliberately targeting children and medics and journalists. That was supposed to trigger some kind of outrage in the world, and instead it triggered complete and total silence and US complicity and effective endorsement of Israeli policy. So we've set ourselves up to exactly what unfolded. There is no common sense scenario in which people live under that kind of brutality and murder at will without that situation exploding, and it did explode. And instead of coming together to try to solve that problem, to try to say, what do serious people who want to see Palestinians and Israelis safe would want out of the situation? The obvious answer is resolve the underlying issues. But instead of resolving the underlying issues, Israel has chosen the path that has led us precisely to here, except expanded 100-fold, which is to further brutalize and murder and ethnically cleanse Palestinians at a far greater scale. And the US is not only indifferent to it, but is actively supporting it. Which brings me to my final point. I know I don't want to run too long on this. We tell ourselves in this country that slavery and genocide of the natives and Jim Crow are all these shameful chapters from our history, and that we're modern people who know better now, and of course if something like that were to happen today, we would not stand for it. And yet we have a foreign policy event unfolding right now in which genocide is being committed, in which children are being deliberately shot in the head and starved to death. And American policy is not only to support it, but to invite the person leading this genocidal onslaught to appear in Congress so members of Congress can stand up and give standing ovations and applause to, as this murderer, war criminal, who's wanted by the ICC prosecutor, delivers speeches defending his absolutely monstrous and indefensible policies. Something is fundamentally wrong, and something desperately needs to change in American policy. And for me, the sign of inspiration about that coming change is the generational divide in public opinion, and the fact that young people get it, see it. They don't rely on corporate media to get their information. They see what's happening through social media. And that change is coming, but we can't rest in the meantime on the fact that it is coming down the road, because every day that we delay an end to US military funding and support for these genocidal policies that the Israeli government is carrying out is another day in which more and more Palestinian families are destroyed, and Palestinians' ability to survive on their own land and thrive gets diminished and undermined further. I'll leave it at this, and we can talk more in the Q&A.
Thanks, Omar. That was really important points. Really appreciate your insight into this. My name is Zaina. As I was introduced, it's been an honor to work with both of you, Phyllis and Khoury. I also call him Khoury. Loud? I think that's probably the second time in my life that anybody told me that they can't hear me. Usually people are like, can you quiet down a little bit? So I'll take that as a compliment. Thank you. Yes, thank you. And Omar, it's an honor to be on the same panel with you. Thank you, Khoury and Phyllis and IPS for organizing this important event. First, I want to uplift the Palestinian people in Gaza, if you allow me, and all over Palestine, in the refugee camps and in exile. I'll try to get through this without crying, this first part. I'm proud to be a Palestinian, and no matter how many bills they pass to criminalize us no matter how many metal bars and walls they construct to imprison us, and no matter how many bullets and bombs they manufacture to erase us, our existence is ingrained in every olive tree, in every zaghruta, and in every sunrise. It's been really tough on all of us Palestinians, especially these past 10 months, particularly on the ground and particularly in Gaza. But Palestine heals and unites us. And I invite all of you to remember this. Palestine heals and unites us. So I was invited to speak today on Netanyahu's visit as it relates to the United States. And so I wrote a few things. I'm not going to be speaking off the cuff right now, but in the question-answer session, I will be more than happy to delve into more detail. So as Khoury was saying, this is Netanyahu's fourth address to a joint session of Congress, more than any other foreign dignitary or whatever the criminal, I guess, in this case. This is the prime minister who is currently presiding over a genocide. And there could be any day, any moment, there could be a warrant for his arrest by The Hague. Not only is his mere presence in the US an outrage, but his invitation to speak to the US Congress should be looked at as a dangerous endorsement that could have serious ramifications directly affecting the US internationally and the American people directly. This is an indictment of all those who attend his speech without protest. And I encourage all of you to watch your congresspeople and see where they are tomorrow and hold them accountable if they're in there. It's ironic that traditionally Netanyahu and most other Israeli PMs used appearances in the US, particularly to speak to Congress, in order to serve their own electoral interests in Israel, the Zionist entity. Traditionally, as we all know, they meddle in American politics with the assumption that they can wield power to weigh in favor of one party over the other. This became absolutely blatant in the Netanyahu era, in which he took sides, usually with Republicans, particularly during Obama's presidency, and then in lockstep with Trump and, of course, his buddy Kushner. And he, of course, we've heard him say this many times, clearly stated in meetings that he knows how to manipulate American decision-making and American policy. He says it quite bluntly. In 2015, he came without an invitation from the White House. This time, Netanyahu facing severe criticism and dysfunctional political scene, a fragmented society and polity, including divisions between the political and military, between secularists and fundamentalists. That's back home for him. He used Biden and his blind allegiance to Israel in order to demonstrate his bravado that he is the only one that can say no to the US and get away with it. That he can publicly humiliate the president in order to give the perception that he is the one in power. An example was when the Biden administration released the ceasefire agreement that initially he said was Israel's initiative. And they flat out rejected that, Netanyahu did. Netanyahu would not have been able to carry out this genocide without the Biden administration's supply of weapons and money and protection, politically and diplomatically. But at the same time, knowing that he had to undermine Biden in order to improve the chances of Trump winning and buying time to continue with his war crimes and genocide while also manipulating the US administration and US policy. Both the Biden administration and members of Congress were willing to give him cover and repeat his lies to ingratiate themselves with a war criminal, acting in his own self-interest and at the expense, primarily at the expense of Palestinians. A partnership in crime is very clear here, as we mentioned, not only by supplying weapons and money, but it is incredible that Congress was passing bills against Palestinians and our movement, threatening the highest judicial body in the world for the sake of Israel by threatening the ICC and the ICJ and using blackmail and false allegations to enable the most egregious crimes and absolving Israel of any wrongdoing. it's no wonder that he was invited to speak. They work in lockstep. Lately, and given Biden's frailty and incoherence, and the fact that the movement for Palestine have pushed the conversation and became a substantive factor in the elections, with many refusing to vote for Biden, there was a clear chance that he was going to lose this election. And I give credit to all the Palestine movement here. This is a huge credit for everyone. To everyone who mobilized, including the uncommitted movement, but not exclusively. Everybody that was in the streets, everybody that called their congresspeople, everybody that pushed for ceasefire resolutions, everybody for speaking up on social media, for not being silent, for holding people accountable, for refusing to sit back and watch US media and be complacent in this genocide. This is thanks to all of you. Therefore, by stepping down at the last minute, Biden deprived Netanyahu of another card to maneuver with or to play because he got comfortable manipulating Biden's weaknesses. He wanted to empower and activate the Republicans and Trump because they were besties last time. But now it's a different ballgame. With the Democrats mobilizing behind Kamala Harris, Trump is no longer a shoo-in, and pitting one against the other in Congress isn't going to be the determining factor at this point. So it undermines Netanyahu's efforts as well as the Democrats' efforts in genocide. There are clear voices that will and are speaking up and speaking out against his visit and his message, be it in Congress or outside of Congress. He is not coming as a hero, as he did, or as he did in 2015. I don't know if y'all remember. He got 43 standing ovations in Congress. He's not going to be able to use his stature in the US as a means of getting support back in the Zionist entity the way he had intended initially, now that Biden has stepped down. More than 2/3 of his people don't want him in power and don't like him. That's not to say that, they're not complicit in this either, but just for the sake of Israeli politics here. He's coming to continue to sell a genocide as the most unpopular prime minister, and he, of course with US complicity, has managed not only to divide the world's public opinion and American public opinion, but also Jewish public opinion in the US, which the Zionists have long weaponized. He cannot speak on behalf of all Jews at this point, and he knows it. And the genocide drew a red line between Zionists and people of conscience. To support the Israeli regime is to support fascism. Will Kamala shift course? I know that we can push her to, so let's not give her a break on this. One cannot underestimate, even though public opinion is on the move, the power of the Israeli lobby and Zionist influence. Given the vote in Congress, the horrific speeches and statements being made, both houses are willing to host a war criminal and to swallow the fabricated version of a genocide in order to exonerate Israel and Netanyahu, and persist in supporting the process and exasperating the situation by attacking, since October, Lebanon, Syria, Iran, Yemen, and others, and also makes Congress complicit. Instead of stopping a genocide, they'd rather kill more people in other countries. And Biden was caught between his ardent Zionism and his distaste for Netanyahu. Democrats and elected officials have serious soul searching to do at this point with Kamala possibly getting the nomination. And things will never be the same. The easy assumption that the US will blindly follow Israel's plans will no longer go unchallenged because of the Palestine movement, because of all of you all here. Neither Kamala nor others wanted to sit behind Netanyahu as he speaks. I don't know if you all knew this. They went down the line one after the other, and they just refused to sit behind Netanyahu as he speaks. Again, that's not praise for members of Congress. It's just praise to the power of the movement, that they are embarrassed to be with him or seen with him. Even though Congress is bought and paid for, as we know, by the Zionist lobby, public opinion clearly indicates that there is a real shift. The next generations, as Omar pointed out, will soon reach influential positions and will challenge AIPAC and the rest of the Israeli and Zionist lobby's influence and their prepared talking points. And the region is changing as a whole. The Zionist jewel of Biden's crown and Trump's fascist plans, of course, is the regional normalization using blackmail and bribery, and of course the military-industrial complex at its best. The US sought to normalize with Saudi Arabia. That was the focus, repositioning Israel as a major power in the region, representing and defending American interests. It is clear now that Israel has become a huge liability for the US. Note how the US, UK, Germany, and others all rushed to defend Israel military on every occasion, the most powerful country in the Middle East. Israel needed support against a small group of non-state actors like the Palestinian resistance. I mean, imagine this powerful country. There's a clear split in American public opinion, for the first time, really. There's a majority who have been awakened to the truth about Zionist entity and its oppression of the indigenous Palestinian people, and have taken the side of the Palestinian rights movement rather than Israel. They see in Israel a threat to democracy and engaging fully in genocide in which the US is implicated by sending arms, funds, and defending it wholly. I want to say that the focus on Netanyahu should not make anyone think that he is the exception. He isn't. To varying degrees and speeds, prime ministers of Israel have all presided in one way or another over massacres and war crimes. Lest anyone forget that ethnic cleansing and Palestinian erasure is quite literally what Israel is built on. The settler colonization of Palestine would not succeed without unconditional support and empowerment of Western governments, but particularly if it weren't for US imperialist intention. So lastly, I would say here that the power that we saw in the movement leading up to where we are now, and Biden stepping down, and I said this before and I'll say it again, is due to the hard work that we all, everybody here and outside has done and will be doing tomorrow. I hope everybody's going to be joining the protests. My request is to take breaks, to take care of yourself, mind your mental health, but don't stop. Find your space, create your space, speak up, don't allow them to silence you, don't allow them to take away agency of our cause, and always, always remember the focus and remember that Palestine unites us, and Palestine is worth it. So let's keep up the hard work. Thank you.
Wow, this is a hard act to follow here. Luckily, it's not an act. Zaina, that was an extraordinary articulation of a reality of today, and Omar, thank you for all of it. You know, Netanyahu's visit here, as we've been hearing, is not something new. When he came in 2015, he had a very specific task, self-defined task, which was to undermine the Iran nuclear deal. It was very specific. And he did a pretty good job. Really weakened it, made it harder to pass, made it harder this time around to go back to it. Did a pretty good job. He's good, this guy. He's good at what he does. But he's coming this time in a new political moment. And it's a new moment here for all kinds of bizarre reasons of the last 72 hours. I'm not even going to touch that. But it's also a new moment globally. What has not changed, as Omar so passionately defined, is the conditions on the ground for Palestinians. Genocide continues. Genocide is escalating. That is not changing. But the conditions in which the genocide continues and the United States continues to enable that genocide, that is a very different moment. It's not to say that there's part of Netanyahu's goal here is not still to make sure that the US does not stop militarizing as opposed to using diplomacy in its relationship with Iran. That's still going on. That hasn't changed. But the conditions in which this international reality takes shape could not be more different. What we have seen particularly over these last 10 months. So on the one hand, the international community a good answer to that. My answer is always, I don't think countries have rights. People have rights. Israelis have the rights. They have the right to live without fear. Okay? They don't have the right to dominate another people. And the country of Israel does not have that right. Well, what about that country that you live in? Yeah, well, what about it? It doesn't have rights either. When we look at our history of settler colonialism, of our history of enslavement, of our history of racism and Jim Crow segregation, we see the reality of our history. That doesn't mean our country had the right to impose it until someday suddenly people realize, oh, you know, maybe that's not such a good idea, maybe we better change it. Countries don't have rights. And more people are starting to understand that. And what we're seeing now is a new level of power fighting for rights for Palestinians, recognizing those rights and fighting to make sure that that happens in the United Nations, in the International Criminal Court, in the International Court of Justice, UN agencies, UN representatives. Doesn't mean it's succeeding so far. The UN in particular, pretty weak still, pretty weak. Over 200 UN staffers have been killed in the Israeli genocide in Gaza. And yet, Israeli leaders, right up to the Secretary General, who I have no doubt means well in some personal way, but that doesn't matter, because what he does not do anything to stop those assaults on his own staff, on UN schools, on UN hospitals, on, last week, UN headquarters in Gaza was destroyed. Did we hear outrage at the United Nations? No. We heard expressions of concern. Great. Now what? But the difference, and the reason that I'm a little bit hopeful, partly because of what Zaina talked about in terms of our movement, that's what gives me real hope. But I also have some hope for what's changing in this international reality. The focus of international agencies now that are focusing on rights have gone way farther than we've seen in the past. It's not an accident that the Israeli Knesset last week voted against a two-state solution, explicitly, not just the far right that's always opposed it. And I'm using far right in the Israeli context, which, you know what that means. Off the charts, exactly. What chart could there possibly be? I mean, keep in mind that in his government, in his cabinet, Benjamin Netanyahu is one of the farthest left in that cohort. That's a very frightening reality, but it is a reality. You know, one of his colleagues, I don't know what to say, calls himself a homophobic fascist. No, sorry, it's the other way around. A fascist homophobe, that's what he calls himself. It's not my words. That's what he calls himself because he's proud of it. So that's what we are dealing with. But the international community is starting to change. There were 18 countries who cut their support for UNRWA after Israel made an entirely false set of claims about unnamed members of UNRWA's staff out of thousands of UNRWA staff in Gaza, that 13 of them were allegedly involved in some illegal action on October 7th. There was no evidence. A separate set of investigations at the United Nations proved there was never any evidence. But 18 countries, in immediate response led by the United States, cut their entire support for UNRWA, the only UN agency with the capacity to provide the level of humanitarian, desperately needed assistance that Gaza requires. 17 of them have now restored their funding. And about half of those 17 have actually raised the amount of money that they are giving to UNRWA because they recognize the importance of it. But guess what? Guess what government has not? Only one, right down the street. Maybe we should visit them and remind them that we know this. You know, it's an extraordinary thing. The notion that the once largest funder of UNRWA, the United States, the biggest single country donation comes from the US every year. Even now, even with proof that there was never any evidence of this so-called crime, and even if there were, this is one of those great even if moments. You know, when you look at international law, one of the things it says is, even if some people did some bad stuff, you're not allowed to punish an entire population for what 17 people did, and in this case, didn't do. So it's a great even if reminder. But the US is the one country that has not restarted its support. In that context, the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in the Occupied Palestinian Territory, Francesca Albanese, said, and I will quote her, my good friend Francesca, "The only reasonable inference that can be drawn is that there is now an Israeli state policy of genocidal violence towards the Palestinian people in Gaza." Now, her job is to investigate human rights in the occupied Palestinian territory. She is the 6th special rapporteur. And all the rapporteurs have identified extraordinary levels of human rights violations. I don't think, and I haven't checked with all of them, but I don't think any of them said that Israel has a state policy of genocidal violence. That's part of the new change in where the international community is and the willingness of experts to say what is true and not be concerned about both sidesism and not be afraid of what's the US going to do. The US is doing plenty in response, as we know, but people are no longer afraid. In the International Criminal Court, there's been an effort that has been underway for years to get an investigation, a serious criminal investigation of crimes committed by specific individuals who would be held accountable as individuals, not as governments, but individual people who either commanded or carried out war crimes and crimes against humanity in the occupied Palestinian territory. And for years, they have delayed and ignored it and came back and said, well, we're investigating, and well, we don't know about the jurisdiction, and well, we're not sure. Well, guess what? Finally, after extraordinary levels of pressure, because this guy really didn't want to do it, was forced to take a real action and take the first step. It's not a done deal yet. But he took the crucial first step. This is the lead prosecutor in The Hague at the International Criminal Court to ask for arrest warrants to be issued against Benjamin Netanyahu, against his defense secretary, and against 2 leading members of Hamas. The notion that individuals could be held accountable for war crimes is an extraordinary shift in where the international reality is. This goes back to the Pinochet precedent, which we at IPS take very seriously, because one of the crimes that Augusto Pinochet, the dictator of Chile, after the coup of 1973, was responsible for was the murder of our two comrades here in Washington, D.C. in 1973, Orlando Letelier and Ronnie Carpin Moffett. Many of you have come with us every year to celebrate the human rights awards given in their name, which I'm very glad to say two of the awardees this year will be the Institute for Middle East Understanding, that does such extraordinary work on media, and Rabbis for Ceasefire, which has come together to demand a ceasefire in this context. This is all a sideline, but I couldn't resist saying it. But what we now have is the International Criminal Court waiting for the judges to answer their chief prosecutor's request to issue international arrest warrants. Imagine if that was already underway. Would Netanyahu be quite so confident that he could land here with no problem because he had to fly over a few other countries and might need to land to refuel his plane? What if he had to land at Shannon Airport, the usual international stop? What would the Irish do? Ireland has emerged as the country most supportive in all of Europe. Wanted for genocide. Thank you, Anne Wright. The country in Europe most supportive of Palestinian rights. Would he be willing to do this? We know that Henry Kissinger, who unfortunately died before he could be really held accountable, he was 100, but he still died too soon. So it was the same with Pinochet. He died before he could be put on trial. But he died in custody, and we hold on to that. They were not worried that the United States was going to hold them accountable. But they were worried. Kissinger called the State Department every time he was going to travel to see if it was safe. And he said when he wanted to go to Brazil and to Belgium, they told him, don't go. How cool is that? You know? That's the moment that we are approaching for the war criminals carrying out genocide today against the people of Palestine. Then we get to the International Criminal Court. You all know the extraordinary work that South Africa has done to bring charges, and I'm glad to welcome diplomats and friends from South Africa here tonight, back there. The extraordinary work that South Africa has done to represent the interests of the international community in the International Court of Justice, the highest court in the world, the United Nations Court, not the International Criminal Court, the court that puts countries on trial, governments on trial. That's what we're looking at. That's what South Africa did. It broke the taboo that said that only the white colonial countries can use these institutions, and that these institutions belong to the global South as well. That was a huge breakthrough. But it wasn't the only one, because what we saw was that the court was willing to listen and found that, yes, Israeli actions are plausibly genocidal and that they must stop. That they must stop. They issued orders. And what's so extraordinary about the role of the Genocide Convention, unlike most parts of international law, some of you have heard me talk about this before because it's the one extraordinary thing, it holds other countries accountable besides the country that's directly responsible. So in this case, this is South Africa's case against the state of Israel for Israeli violations, deliberate violations of the crime of genocide. But the court didn't stop there. The court said that every country that is a state party to the Genocide Convention, which is the overwhelming majority of countries in the world, including our own, are also liable for making sure that genocide can never happen, and if it ever does, that they must do everything in their power to stop it. So our government right now is in violation of international law directly ordered by the International Court of Justice. And now, we have the new Court of Justice resolution, the ruling, that just came down last Friday. They had the decency this time to make their ruling at 3 o'clock in the afternoon in The Hague, so we could watch it at 9 o'clock in the morning, other than having to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning. Okay, let's see hands. Who got up at 4 o'clock in the morning to watch the South Africans argue at the International Court of Justice? The rest of you are sluggards. Where were you? Where were you? But this time, you didn't have to get up till 9 o'clock to watch it. To watch the 15 judges issue their response. This was not about the genocide in Gaza. This was a much bigger issue. This was the question of the Israeli occupation, which the International Court of Justice has now ruled constitutes apartheid. This is not just any longer human rights organizations around the world. This is now the highest court in the world has ruled that Israel's rule is the rule of apartheid, and it must stop now. And it went on to say that not only are the settlements illegal and that new settlement activity must halt, it said that the settlers must be evacuated. Not, let's have some more discussion of a two-state solution, and let's have another Oslo process, and let's have a lot of process and not a lot of peace, and not any justice. They said we need action. We need the settlers out. They weren't saying that the Palestinians have to now sit down with the Israelis to discuss whether or not the settlements should be stopped and the settlers should be forced out. They said the settlers have to be evacuated. That's extraordinary. It had never happened before. And if we think back for just a minute, coming back to our movement, you know, it took about 20 years from the first beginnings in this country of the discussion of apartheid as the appropriate term for Israeli policy inside Israel and in the occupied territory and towards refugees and exiles among the rest of the Palestinian population. It took 20 years to recognize that. Palestinians had recognized it way before that. South Africans had recognized it way before that. But in this country, it took about 20 years to make that an understood assumption. In the case of Gaza, after October of 2023, it took about 20 days to normalize the understanding that it was genocide that characterized what Israel was doing to the people of Palestine, and particularly in Gaza. So I think that this notion that now the new, most recent finding by the International Court of Justice that says that the entire apparatus of apartheid and occupation, they didn't use the term colonialism, but it was part of it. You could smell it in how they spoke of the origins, was all illegal and had to be stopped. And it was an overwhelming majority, near unanimity, for all of the decisions. Only the same judge from Uganda who voted against every one of the earlier ones around the South African case, again voted with Israel to protect Israel. The US judge and the European judges all voted with the majority. That was crucial. They voted as independent judicial officers of the court, not as representatives of their corrupt governments. That was an extraordinary thing. And let me just quote one line from that ruling. It says that, and this is particularly relevant to our government, that all states are under the obligation to, quote, not recognize as legal the situation arising from Israel's presence and not to render aid or assistance to maintain that presence in the occupied Palestinian territory. Could they give us a better definition of the need for an arms embargo? One of the things that our movement has achieved in the 10 months since the assault on Gaza began is that we have changed the definition of a ceasefire. We have held to the message discipline of calling for ceasefire now. But the ceasefire we are calling for now is something very different than the ceasefire of October of 2023. Because the ceasefire we are demanding now includes three things, not just one. It includes a ceasefire, stop bombing, stop shooting, stop tank fire, stop all of it. And it includes the massive access to humanitarian assistance that is so desperately required to stop the famine that is the other part of genocide that's already underway. And it means stop sending the weapons that are enabling the genocide in the first place. Without all three, it's not a ceasefire. So when Joe Biden talks about a ceasefire, he changed his language because of our movement. Because remember at the beginning when he wouldn't say the word ceasefire? It was us that made him do it. But it's not enough. Now we have to fight for the ceasefire that we need, that starts with an end to all of the weapons that are being sent. That's part of our broader definition. It's part of our job. We have a lot of work to do. Thank you.
Pretty extraordinary panel. And now we open it up to you all. I believe the good folks at Busboys gave me this wireless mic so I could go out into the crowd like Oprah. Pro-Palestine Oprah. Oh, can I? Can I? Well, in any case, anybody? Yeah? Okay, so you can put your hands up and we'll make it happen.
Thank you so much for your comments today. My question, Phyllis, I mean, we saw what it took to get the settlers, so-called settlers, out of Gaza. I mean, that was a scene that people should go back and look at the videotape. They did some horrific things to their own people to stay there. How are they ever going to get these 600,000 people that are occupying in the West Bank out?
Very good question. First of all, it's 900,000 now. If you include occupied East Jerusalem, it's about 750,000 in the West Bank, 250,000 in occupied Jerusalem. We're talking close to 1 million people. I don't think anybody necessarily thinks that's going to happen right away, that they're going to be evacuated. By whom exactly? The International Court of Justice does not have, not only does it not have an army, it doesn't even have a police force. It doesn't even have a process server who can go around and, you know, I used to be a process server. I know how that works. They don't have one. I was going to go volunteer, but I don't think it would work. I think the point is that it's a tool. Like all international law, it's not self-enforcing. It's a tool for those of us ready to fight for it. That means governments, and most of all, it means people. It means the Palestinians leading their own struggle, and it means those of us around the world standing with them to say, we've got your back. We're going to make this happen. And the issue, again, is rights. What Omar said is so crucial about who lives where. People live somewhere. They can live somewhere. What they can't do is prevent other people from living there and steal the land of the people that were there first. That's what they can't do. Some settlers want to stay there as Palestinian citizens or as citizens of however many states there are. This is not about how many states. This is about rights. And that's what we're dealing with. This is an incredible tool for us to use when we're talking to members of Congress, because there's a couple dozen members of Congress who actually care about international law. Maybe they'll start a caucus, the International Law Caucus. You know, never thought of that before, but that's certainly an option. So it's a tool for us to use in our struggle and for other governments to use to convince their own parliaments, their own populations, and to stand up to the United States.
I just want to add one small thing to say, just on the point of everybody should be able to live wherever they want to. All that needs to happen with the settlements is Israel has to announce that they are leaving, that this is not Israeli territory, this is Palestinian territory, and anybody who stays behind is going to be subject to Palestinian law. And most of the settlers will back up and leave. I mean, they don't want to be part of a Palestinian state in which they are effectively, however you want to put it, what visa permits or work permits, what might be applied, or whether they're going to be applying for Palestinian citizenship or whatever. This is not Israeli territory. The Israeli government has to relinquish control, and if they do, most of the settlers would leave. And I think what happened in Gaza is partly theater to draw out this agony in which, Israel can empty out half of Gaza City in one afternoon through unspeakable violence, dropping, literally using murderous violence. In the case of the settlers, it's partly this theater that unfolded to show you the national trauma of withdrawing settlements and how strongly these people felt about that land and so on. Meanwhile, while they were withdrawing settlers out of Gaza, they were putting even more settlers in the West Bank. They withdrew 8,000 out of Gaza, put 12,000 in the West Bank during the same period. So instead of a withdrawal, what Israel was doing was an expansion of the occupation, and one aspect of it was the theater aspect, so that afterwards, when they deliberately constricted Gaza and ensured that it failed, they can say, we put our people through so much trauma, and what emerged is not a successful Palestinian society or entity that wants to live with us in peace. That was part of the narrative and part of the rhetoric. So just something to keep in mind on that.
And to add quickly here that part of the policy of Israel is changing the demographic, not just the demographic, but actually the composition of the ground, meaning they built a 25-foot concrete wall. So like even if you empty settlements, quote unquote, or even if you incorporate them, there's still a massive wall on Palestinian land. They still control water aquifers. They still control every aspect of Palestinian life. So while it's very easy to say, empty the settlements, it's not enough. There's so much more that needs to be done. And we know that Netanyahu actually ran on a no two-state solution. So it's not like it was a secret that he wanted to have a two-state solution or not. He held up a map of, I think it was Greater Israel at the time, at the UN. So long as the international community and so long as the United States is not willing to act and apply international law, all of this is nonsense. All of this is just to add words on paper. So it takes all of us, again, to put pressure on our elected officials to apply international law and to apply US law as it relates to Israel and Palestine. In fact, if you speak to any of the elected officials in the US, for example, in Virginia, Tim Kaine, he always says, but we support the two-state solution. You ask him, okay, you support the two-state solution. Does that mean you support emptying the settlements? Does that mean? And they're quiet because it's not about that. It's talking points that they use to take away agency for Palestinians, to take away the rights of the Palestinians, and to continue empowering Israel, giving them the space and the time to empty the land of its indigenous people. So it's
Just one quick thing on the international law aspect of this. It's sometimes used as a talking point, as Zaina just said, that we pulled out of Gaza. Gaza is still occupied because the definition of occupation is not the presence of soldiers or settlers on any particular spot of land, it's control. It's effective control of the territory. When Israel pulled out, they didn't pull their soldiers out, they redeployed them from inside the fence to outside the fence. They are still in control of the water, of the skies, of the water, of everything. So Gaza, and this was again reaffirmed by the International Court of Justice on last Friday, Gaza is still occupied territory.
Saw a hand back there. Met me halfway.
Exactly. First of all, I want to congratulate everybody for being a citizen of the world. You know, I come from a family that's mixed, but they're human. You know what I'm saying? It's black, white, Japanese, Korean. The separatist elements in this world today have a way of doing what it is that they do. It's poisoning us by separating us. So I came here to protest with my citizens of the world. And tomorrow, I'll be singing that famous song, Ain't Gonna Let Nobody Turn me around, turn me around, turn me around. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. I'm gonna keep on walking, keep on talking, keeping on marching on. I will see you guys tomorrow.
Thank you.
Hello. Okay, great. Oh my lord, that's weird to hear your own voice on a mic. Hey, I just want to thank you all so much. This has been an amazing talk. Currently, I go to American University, and recently, this past semester, we got a BDS resolution passed. Thank God. Yes. And within 45 minutes, the quickest the administration has ever responded, they immediately shot it down. They said they were not going to implement it. They cited some policy from like a decade ago. Obviously, we expected that. We're still mobilizing. We're still organizing on several different fronts. But I think one of the things that I've been a little bit confused about moving forward is, this is not the time to blank right now. One of the things that we're kind of confused about moving forward is that the Zionist entity happens to be just so interworked, like baked into the institution of AU currently and AU administration, stuff like that. That sometimes I think I met a couple people who were like, it's kind of futile to move forward with organizing because it's just not going to work at AU. I thankfully don't believe that, but I think one of the things is that like, my question to all of you is, in working in an institution, in working against an institution that is so heavily like Zionist strong, I don't really know how to say that, so heavily and deeply aligned with Israel and its ideology, how do you go about, what recommendations would you guys give in order to fight against that and dismantle that? As much as possible. Sorry, long question. That took me a while to face that. Thank you.
Thank you.
First of all, it's not futile. Every effort that you put in is a step forward. Don't ever think that it's futile. If it was, we'd stop at 75 years ago for Palestine. Palestine is a marathon. The liberation movement is a marathon. It's not a sprint. So every step that you make, every encampment, every interview you give, everything you write is a step forward. Learn about the university. Learn about how they make the rules. Learn who's doing what and where and expose them. That's one tactic of doing it. Use coalitions. Work with outside organizations in order to utilize, whether it's in the media, whether it's with donors, because universities very often rely on donors, especially alumni. Get in touch with these people. Advocate. Use the tactics that they use for elections. Canvassing, phone calls, make rosters, and don't leave it. A lot of people, especially in college campuses, it's a 4-year school, sometimes more, but on average, it's 4 years, right? Make sure you're passing down the torch so that whatever you are working on now is not sort of reinventing the wheel for the next people to come up. And don't expect results immediately because expectations means disappointment. Minor advancements in advocacy are huge right now, and continuing the pressure is huge. Also, some universities are easier to move than others. Maybe in some universities, ceasefire resolutions or divestment might be easier than others. Some might be just even finding a coalition to work with within the school campus is important. Also, this working on university campuses and having them divest is the microcosm of the larger complex situation. So while you are working on the micro level, always try to find ways to connect to the external complex aspect of this, because you will find support, you will find help, you will find empowerment, whether it's in speakers, whether it's in donations, whether in expertise that people have done it before you. Remember, the Palestine movement didn't start October 7th. The Palestine movement started 75 years ago and will continue until liberation, right? So we're here for, all of us in the movement are here for each other and plan ahead. Also, actually, it's really important to know your rights as students, as individuals, on school campuses and outside of school campuses. So make sure you know your rights, make sure you know your university, make sure you know who's involved, who's getting the money and from where, and then go target them any way you know how. And we're happy to help. There's many of us who are working with university students who support the efforts. And thank you so much. You all did such an incredible effort. Without you, the needle would not have moved the way it had. So all the respect. And the way it was done was incredible. The level of organization, the level of respect for everyone that was in the encampments, not just at AU, everywhere. Really, really moving and really historic. So congratulations.
I just want to note that literally every single injustice in history seemed impossible to defeat at the point that it was at its height. And so what they want from you, I mean, you are presented with an adversary that is incredibly powerful, influential, and well-connected, but the goal is to make us feel like they're too powerful to challenge. And history is filled with examples of people who started out being outgunned, figuratively speaking, and finding a way to make it through. And it is through sheer persistence that we absolutely will get to the point where we need to get on this issue.
And just one other part of that, of exactly that, is that in so many times, and this comes back to the example of South Africa, it's not just that they eventually happen, it's that people are convinced it can't happen, it's just never going to, and it's just no way it's going to work until suddenly it becomes not just possible but inevitable. That's the way it's always been, and there's no reason to think this one's going to be any different.
There's a bunch of questions in the audience. This is a little, I didn't expect this, but we actually got somebody who's watching the stream got my number and texted me a question. So I'm gonna read this question and then I'm gonna go back to the audience gathered here. So directed at Omar. Omar, can you please just give a quick analysis of tomorrow's speech? 1, why is Netanyahu coming? 2, why now? 3, what does he want to accomplish? 4, what does he need to accomplish? 5, will he do it? I didn't know that. I mean, Omar is very powerful. I didn't know he could see the future. 6, how does U.S. reception of this speech affect the presidential race and the prospects for actually ending the Gaza genocide?
Look, the speech happened because the Republicans want to use Israel as a wedge issue right now against the Democrats. It was primarily a Republican invitation, and because you can count on the Democrats to be spineless every single step of the way, they went along with it, and they added their names to it. Chuck Schumer, in one breath, says Netanyahu has no place in Israel and should not be its leader and should step down, and in the next breath invites him to come and speak to Congress. It's honestly too comical to even try to comment on. And this is a moment in which the Republicans feel that they can do better electorally if they present themselves as a party that is more pro-Israel and to say the Democrats are weak in Israel. And the Democrats are desperate to prove that they also are pro-Israel, and so they chase after this. And from Netanyahu's perspective, I think he wants 2 things. 1, there is a regional dynamic that is very uncomfortable for Israel right now, of what is described as the axis of resistance, Iran and some of its allies in Lebanon and Yemen, who are putting military pressure on Israel at the moment. And Israel cannot do what it typically does to Palestinians, which is just respond with overwhelming force, obliterate everybody in sight, and emerge victorious in a short period of time. They're unable to do it in Gaza because the militants in Gaza were so prepared for what is about to unfold, and they most certainly can't expand it on their own to take on Hezbollah in Lebanon, to take on the Houthis in Yemen. And so what they want, what Netanyahu is probably, I'm willing to bet on it, is going to do is fearmonger against Iran, which they see as this hub that is supporting, that is the primary source of support for this network. because Netanyahu wants nothing more than to drag the U.S. into a direct confrontation with Iran that Israel cannot handle on its own. That is part of what Netanyahu wants to do. And as part of a more confined aspect of it for Palestinians, I think Netanyahu wants to buy time in order to see what a potential genocide of Gaza looks like with the Trump administration. That is speculative on my part, but I think it's reasonable to assume that there's stuff that is unfolding on the ground that we know is happening. We know that Israel is trying to ethnically cleanse huge parts of northern Gaza and to take over them. That can't be their declared policy because that puts them in rhetorical conflict with the Biden administration. Biden is arming genocide, so there's no way to, this is not to minimize the horrific harm that Biden is currently imposing. But to potentially get a President Trump who has shown us in the past what he's capable of when it comes to Israel and Palestine, who in his past administration appointed David Friedman, a fanatical religious extremist, as ambassador to Israel, recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital in violation of international law, moved the U.S. embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, shut down the Palestinian diplomatic mission in Washington, D.C. and kicked them out, claimed that Israeli settlements in the West Bank are legal, gave them legal legitimacy, recognized Israel's annexation of the Golan Heights in Syria. I mean, it was just Israel's wish list. It was literally do whatever you want and we're behind you 100%. And unlike Biden, who arms and enables Israel to carry out its policies, but publicly says, no, we're against it and we're concerned and we think Israel should not bomb indiscriminately, and we, kind of like struggling in terms of their public engagement on this because they know what Israel's doing is so horrific. A Trump administration most likely would just say, go and do whatever you want to Gaza, flatten it, occupy whatever parts of it. And I think Netanyahu wants to buy himself some time. He's engaging in American politics on some level in order to pit our politicians against each other on this idea that Israel is in desperate need of support and he's going to do more to support him in order to extend the duration of this onslaught. Right now, the entire world knows, anybody who's paying attention, again, I guess if you're only consuming corporate media, you wouldn't know. The only impediment to ceasefire is Benjamin Netanyahu. Hamas has bent over backwards to accommodate demands that are fundamentally unreasonable for a ceasefire. Hamas was willing to release all Israel's hostages in exchange for a permanent ceasefire. And that was, and Netanyahu insisted that they would only agree to a temporary ceasefire and that the slaughter must be permitted to continue afterwards. And then Hamas, under immense pressure, through the United States government, through the Qatari government, basically said, fine, we'll take a temporary ceasefire with only a possibility of a permanent one. And Netanyahu still found a way to say no to that deal. And what Netanyahu is looking for is any possible way to extend this onslaught, any reason to continue it, any way to continue American support for it, in the hopes, looking at the polls, that things are going to get even worse, if that's imaginable, in terms of American foreign policy with a potential Trump administration, and to carry out far, far more dangerous policies. I don't think he's going to succeed on the Iran front, unless, again, with Trump, it's really unpredictable. There's practically zero chance that the Biden administration is going to go for a direct confrontation with Iran at the moment. They made it very clear. The Israelis have been asking for it very aggressively, and several U.S. officials have made clear that they have no interest and no intention for that, and they kept pushing for a toning down and pushing for a ceasefire and urging restraint. And once again, what Netanyahu is hoping for is that Trump comes in, and then there is the potential for this massive, horrific regional war that could literally, not figuratively, literally kill millions of people in the region were it to happen. It is a really uncertain future, but certainly between now and the end of the current administration, I don't see the possibility for that wider regional war with direct use involving being articulated.
Thank you for that. That was an extraordinary roundup of the regional situation. I would add just one point, and that is, I agree with you on the assessment here of what is likely and not likely. The one other thing that I think is going on, though, is that Netanyahu's rationale goes beyond the political goals that he wants to achieve, which are exactly what you just identified. It's also the personal goal of staying out of jail. It's very immediate. It's very personal. What I mentioned earlier about Netanyahu being the left of his cabinet, the reason that he has allied himself with the fascist right, which are not his natural allies, is that they are the only ones who promised him that they would keep him in power as prime minister as long as he made the war continue. The minute he signs off on a ceasefire, if they, 2 or 3 of them in the cabinet who are the far fascist right, if they make good on their threat, they will throw him under a bus by bringing down the government, and he will be left not prime minister anymore, because it's very clear his own popularity wouldn't get there, and would face going to prison. Because unlike this country, the Israelis, when their former leaders are convicted, they actually send them to prison. We might want to learn something like that. I'm just saying. But that personal demand for safety, to stay out of jail, is very much at the core of the intensity of, in my view, of what drives Netanyahu right now.
Okay. Beautiful. So we're nearing the end. I'm going to take the last 3 questions, 4. That's it. And then give our speakers the last word. Yeah. So.
Hi, my question is to the panel, and specifically the mechanism you think will be most effective in ending this. And I will give that by South Africa by example. It is widely accepted that